When an old desert rancher is arrested simply for lending his horse to a wounded Zuni messenger, something feels deeply wrong. Sheriff McClintock, backed by a ruthless, land-hungry corporation, thought intimidation and silence would bury the truth forever. But fate had other plans. Plans set in motion by an ancient document, a rising of tribes, and one man's quiet defiance. Just wait until you see how this story turns, and why justice, against all odds, finally stood tall. Evening came slow and heavy in the high desert, the kind that draped itself across the land like a wool blanket pulled over tired bones. The last of the heat shimmered above sandstone ridges, and the red dust clung to the sky like it didn't want to leave. Eli Brenner rode south along the rim of his property, a rough stretch of land that gave nothing for free. His mare, Clara, moved steady between creosote and scrub pine, her hooves soft in the sand, as if she too understood this hour wasn't meant for noise. Eli wasn't young anymore, but he moved like a man who'd paid for his silence in places nobody spoke of. The lines in his face weren't just from sun, they were from holding in too much for too long. A rancher by trade, but by nature something else entirely. The kind of man who noticed small changes, a crooked fence post, a buzzard circling too low, or how lately the horizon had started to feel narrower, boxed in by hands that didn't belong here. Out west, the land was changing, not by storm, but by paperwork and pavement. Sun Mesa Development Company had been swallowing ranch land and tribal territory like a fire gone unchecked. They came with maps and smiles, then left with deeds and silence. And always the sheriff, Mac McClintock, stood just behind them, hat tilted, badge polished, words slippery as oil. Eli had kept his head low through most of it. Not because he didn't care, but because in the desert, survival often meant patience. But patience wasn't the same as blindness. That night, as he crested the south bluff, he saw it. A plume of dust rising too fast for wind. A rider. The silhouette bucked and swayed, wrong for a man with strength in his limbs. Eli slowed Clara to a trot, hand already resting near the lever of the old rifle on his saddle. When the figure reached the base of the canyon, the shape became clearer. A young man, no older than 20, draped over a painted Mustang, blood soaking the front of his shirt and trailing down his leg. His bow was broken clean across his back. No gun, no saddlebag, just desperation. As the rider slid from his horse, he crumpled into the dust like a scarecrow tossed aside. Eli was off Clara before she stopped. He dropped to one knee and caught the young man before his head hit stone. The boy's eyes fluttered like torn cloth, and his voice came cracked and dry. "They're surrounded, Mesa Village. We tried to send word to Chaco, but I got hit." His accent was Zuni, light but proud, and despite the pain, there was urgency more than fear in his voice. Eli pressed a canteen to the boy's lips, letting him take 2 slow swallows. The wound in the leg was bad, clean through, but no arterial spray. He'd make it if he got help. But the bigger question loomed heavy in the air. Who was surrounding whom, and why? "Name," Eli asked, scanning the ridgeline. The last light was fading, turning the sand red. "Tahoe," the boy gasped. "I'm a runner, for the council. I need to reach Chaco before sunrise, or they'll take everything." No badge, no weapon. Just the weight of his ancestors on a bruised back. Eli didn't hesitate. He swung the saddlebag off Clara, yanked free his rifle and canteen, then walked her over to Tahoe and placed the reins in his shaking hands. "She'll get you there. Ride hard. Stay low. If you fall, she'll bring you the rest of the way." Tahoe blinked up at him. Why help me?" Eli looked toward the mesa where the faint shimmer of heat still danced in the air. He thought of the graves near his barn, of a promise made long ago, before survey lines carved this land into lots and profit. "Because this land remembers who stood for it," he said. He helped Tahoe onto Clara's back, steadying him as the young man gritted through pain. Then, with one slap to her flank, the mare was gone, hooves carving through dust, streaking toward the east like firelight in motion. Eli stood alone in the quiet that followed, the sun bleeding into the edge of the earth. He knew this wasn't the end of anything, only the beginning. Behind him, trouble was already moving. But he didn't reach for fear. He reached for Steel Dot. They didn't knock. They never did. 3 men in company flannel and clean boots waited at Eli's porch just before dawn, hands near their belts, eyes scanning his barn as if they already owned it. One read off a charge, the other clicked cold steel around Eli's wrists, and the third knocked his hat to the dirt with the kind of smirk that carried no badge, but wore power all the same. Eli didn't argue. He knew the show wasn't for him. It was for the neighbors watching from darkened windows wondering who'd be next. They threw him into the back of a county cruiser and drove east, past the edge of his fence line, over dry riverbeds, and through the cracked asphalt streets of Drywell, a town that had long since stopped pretending to serve anything but contracts and convenience. When the station came into view, Eli said nothing. The building had been built by his grandfather's hands, back when wood still smelled of hope and the stars overhead meant something. Now the windows were barred, the paint peeling, and the cells inside colder than he remembered. Sheriff McClintock was waiting for him, broad-shouldered, tie askew, face smooth but eyes too polished. He waved the paperwork like a badge of honor and led Eli down the corridor without a word. Inside the cell, the cot was bare, the toilet chipped, and the walls carried the stories of too many people who'd once thought they had rights. 3 days. That's how long they kept him there. 3 days of silence, dust, and the occasional clang of metal as boots passed the bars. No charges read, no trial. Just a repeated phrase echoed from behind the desk. He assisted an active threat to corporate stability. On the second night, McClintock came to visit. Not for the law, but for pride. "You helped a criminal," he said through the bars, voice low like a snake under brush. "That Zuni boy was interfering with federal development. He's lucky he's not in a ditch." Eli stood, his back straight, though sleep had not touched him. "You calling a tribal messenger a criminal now?" "I'm calling him what the state calls him. And you? You're an old, stubborn cowboy with no land rights and too much memory. You think this land still belongs to ghosts? The world's moving forward. We're building something better." "I've seen your kind of better," Eli replied quietly. "I saw it in Iraq and in the strip malls of Arizona, and I'll tell you this, whatever you build on the bones of people who don't get a say, it never lasts. It just sinks into the sand." McClintock didn't respond. He stared for a moment longer, then walked away with the clatter of keys echoing behind him. By the third night, silence wrapped the jailhouse like smoke. Then, a soft sound. A pebble against the window. Eli moved to the barred pane and squinted into the dark. A shadow stepped forward from the alley. A man, wrapped in a faded wool blanket, hair silver and braided, eyes as deep as old riverbeds. His name was Joseph Whitebear, and Eli had known him since they were boys, climbing the same canyon walls. "Your horse made it," the old man said softly. "Tahoe's alive. Got to Chaco in time." Word spread fast. Eli exhaled, but didn't smile. "The village?" Joseph looked down. "Gone, but not lost. They're coming, Eli. Not just Zuni, Apache, Dine, Hopi. Word of what you did went far. They remember. All those times you lent a rope or water or helped repair a well, they didn't forget." "They're coming to make peace?" Joseph looked up, and his voice was like the wind before a storm. "No, son. They're coming for truth." And in that moment, in a cell built by his bloodline, Eli felt something shift. Not freedom, not anger, but a rising tide, one that didn't ask for permission, only respect. They hadn't expected this. Sheriff McClintock stood on the south ridge before sunrise, his boot grinding into brittle stone as he watched a line of figures stretch across the valley, like a scar carved into the land. It wasn't a protest, not the kind with chants or signs. There were no megaphones, no speeches, just silhouettes in motion, quiet, steady, unshaken. Men and women walked in long formations, some on horseback, others carrying children or guiding elders. The desert wind tugged at their blankets and braids, lifting the edges of woven banners marked with symbols older than any law McClintock had ever enforced. Zuni, Dine, Hopi, Apache, Comanche. Their flags moved not like warnings, but memories, brought back to life in color and cloth. Among them walked a boy wrapped in linen, legs stiff, chest rising slow. Tahoe, and beside him, unmistakable even at a distance, was Clara, Eli's horse. Her coat painted in red clay, feathers tied to her mane like echoes from another century. She moved without a saddle, her steps sure and slow, as if she knew her place in what was coming. Behind them, the mesa stood calm but alert, not defiant, not angry, just awake. Word had spread fast. too fast for the town's handlers to silence. The arrest of Eli Brenner had stirred more than local sympathy. It cracked something wide open. Tribes who rarely stood shoulder to shoulder now formed a wall of presence. Elders with walking sticks, war veterans with faded jackets, children with silent eyes. They didn't come to fight. They came to be seen, to remind the land who still walked it. Back in Dry Well, pressure had built like steam behind closed doors. A Cherokee lawyer, flown in from Santa Fe, delivered the writ in person. "You have no legal grounds to hold him," he said plainly. "And if you don't let him walk, I'll make sure this courthouse becomes a case study in every constitutional law class in the Southwest." They unlocked Eli's cell without a word. He stepped out not with swagger, but with a calm forged over decades of watching storms pass. As he emerged into the open, a guard leaned close and said softly, "You ever seen silence rise up like smoke? What's coming up that hill? It's not a protest, it's a reckoning." By the time Eli reached the mesa's edge, the sun was still hiding behind the eastern peaks. But even in shadow, he saw it clearly. The old stone circle at the summit, once used for council, now surrounded by thousands. Not all held weapons, but some did. Spears carved by hand, blades passed down generations. But none were raised. Instead, 300 spears had been planted upright in the ground, tips polished, shafts steady, their formation deliberate. They weren't aimed, they weren't thrown. They simply stood like sentinels of memory. The mercenaries from Sun Mesa Company arrived in armored trucks, helmets glinting, eyes shielded behind glass. But the closer they came to the mesa, the slower they moved. The stillness wasn't weakness, it was weight. It pressed down on the air until every breath came with thought. The council began without ceremony. Elders stepped forward one by one, speaking in different tongues but sharing the same message. "We are not leaving. This is not land on a page. This is not a development zone. This is memory, bone, and breath. We remember every line they erased. And now we draw it back." Eli stood just outside the circle, his hat in hand, gaze steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His horse stood beside him, and that was enough. A boy had ridden her through fire. A people had followed. And now the ground itself felt like it was waiting to be heard. Dot. They made him walk. Sheriff McClintock climbed the narrow path to the mesa's crest with the sun at his back and the wind tugging at his coat. 2 guards flanked him, their hands close to their belts, and 3 corporate attorneys followed, shuffling papers and whispering strategy. He'd never looked smaller. Below, the crowd held their silence like a mountain holds its shape, immovable, enduring, unimpressed. Hundreds of faces from dozens of nations watched him ascend. Eyes that had seen generations of treaties broken and borders moved, now focused on one man and one moment. At the center of the circle stood the Zuni elders. Their robes bore patterns not just of art, but of memory. In their hands, scrolls cracked and aged, protected longer than any courthouse ledger. When they spoke, it was not loud, but it was final. They recited a declaration older than most maps, reaffirmed in recent years through an environmental charter signed quietly by the Senate, a move meant to look symbolic. But symbols have roots, and roots, once awakened, don't ask permission to grow. "This land," one elder said calmly, voice steady over the microphones of streaming cameras, "was never sold. It cannot be sold. It lives, and living things cannot be owned." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. It was not a performance. It was a confirmation. The lead lawyer from Sun Mesa shifted in place. His lips moved, but no words came. Another turned pale and checked his phone. News alerts were already hitting the wire. Protected land status confirmed by federal charter. Indigenous Council asserts legal claim. Sun Mesa project loses investor support. Sponsors began to withdraw, one by one. Stockholders stepped away. State observers arrived by helicopter, cameras rolling, faces tight. The system had turned its gaze back toward its own reflection and didn't like what it saw. McClintock stood there, arms stiff, jaw tight, but this was no longer his moment. The badge on his chest didn't carry the weight it used to, and the contracts in his lawyer's hands felt as flimsy as dry leaves. A quiet nod from the state delegate sealed it. He would retreat, not by choice, but by necessity. As the sheriff turned and walked away, he passed Eli Brenner. The rancher stood at the edge of the circle, boots planted, arms folded. McClintock paused, his eyes sharp but tired. "You could have stayed out of this," said Tahoe, approaching Eli with the steadiness of someone who now carried not just message but meaning. I stayed out of it for too long, Eli replied, his voice low but clear. This land doesn't belong to silence. It belongs to those who still hear it breathe. That night, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned bronze, the mesa lit up not with fire or steel, but with presence. The 300 spears were raised again, not for battle, but for reverence. They shimmered in the fading light like mirrored echoes of everything that had ever tried to be erased and refused. Songs rose, soft, layered, carried by languages that had survived centuries, and in their rhythm was no anger, only remembrance. People clasped hands, elders closed their eyes, and even Eli, who'd faced too many hard truths in too many deserts, stood among them, his hat over his chest, his eyes wet but unashamed. Some wars are fought with weapons. Others are won with horses, words, and the weight of knowing when to stand. That day, on a patch of stone the world tried to forget, the earth spoke, and for once, everyone listened.